So I've just recorded. So if there is, we always try and just record their presentation screen rather than people's faces. But if you are particularly sort of mindful of not having your name and face in the recording, please just switch off your camera and the rest, and we'll make sure to keep that private. So yes, thank you for the glowing introduction. And I really am quite overwhelmed about how much interest we've had in this event, which is really lovely. And as Suze mentioned, word learning and vocabulary development is really one of my passion areas. So it's lovely to have a little chunk of time to be able to talk about it. And so we've acknowledged country. I do just also want to acknowledge that this research that I'll be talking about has been done by a broader team. So word learning is a topic that I researched throughout my PhD, and we've continued to research in this space. And so there were lots of other wonderful team members, obviously Suze being one of them, and a lot of other people that aren't able to make it today. And so I also just wanted to come back to this. So as you were all joining, I really appreciate that you were letting us know who you are. And it seems like we have lots of, we would call them speech pathologists or speechies, because we love to cut words down here in Australia, or SLTs. A lot of you, I think, are in the UK. I also just want to be really, really mindful of whether we do have any families that are popping in. The wonderful thing about Engage with DLD is that we often do have family members that are perhaps part of the Engage with DLD database, or even just people in the community. And so if you are here as a family or a person with DLD, please let us know if you're happy to. At the moment, I am probably going to pitch it, I'm tempted to sort of pitch it a little bit more to the SLT level, just because it seems like that's where most people are from. But if you're finding I'm going too fast or using too much jargon, please stop me. That's another thing that us speechies like to do. We love all of the terminology and the words. So please let me know. And Suze, please, alert me to that as well if you're seeing it pop up. But I won't get you to add too much more to the chat, because we have a record of that already. If you haven't introduced yourself, you're very welcome to do that now. Actually, as we're going, I can see somebody in the chat. Wonderful. Thank you to the PhD student who's joined as well. So today I'm going to talk through really in a couple of sections, and we'll pause and do a bit of discussion and some questions and things halfway through, and then again at the end. And so first of all, I just want to cover a little bit about how vocabulary development works, and also the role that memory plays within that. So that was a really big, that's a big interest area for us as a research team, not only knowing, kind of strengths and challenges with word learning, but also some of the factors around why that might happen. And memory capacity is a really big factor to consider there. So I will hone in on a little bit of the research that we've conducted, but I'm also going to be mentioning a couple of the other researchers in this space, so people that aren't part of our team, just because there are lots of other people like Carla McGregor and all of those sorts of teams, Holly Stockel, Katie Gordon, lots of people that are doing research that was a little similar to us. And so I will try and reference them as much as possible so that it's not just our work. And then I'm going to switch a little bit more to kind of just, some of the implications of this research and what it might actually mean for home or the clinic, the classroom. And we'll try and do some reflection on what you're already doing, particularly talking to the SLTs in the room. You might listen to the research and go, great, that's the sort of stuff that I'm doing anyway, that's really lovely reinforcement. Or it might be that you're able to get a couple of other sort of suggestions or next strategies. Okay. So again, all of the speech language therapists in the room will probably know this very, very well. But what do we actually see in terms of vocabulary challenges? So how can that present? Some people talk about the presentation affecting sort of vocabulary breadth. And sometimes it affects vocabulary, or sometimes, a combination of the two. So really it can be difficulties in terms of how many words we know overall, or it can be how well we know those words and how we're able to use them in a really sort of mature, nuanced way across contexts. And in terms of functionally, we see that vocabulary just has such a huge impact on, pretty much everything when we're looking at sort of speaking and listening and reading and writing tasks. So there is, a body of research that summarises impact of vocabulary challenges on things like how we can follow instructions, our reading comprehension, our ability to express our needs and wants, and our ability to sort of comprehend but also express ourselves in narratives and other types of discourse. And I should say as well, for people that are really interested in the literature, I have lots of references at the end, and I'm really happy to share the slides with people at the end as well. So if you're keen to go off and do a little bit more reading, you can go
Emily,
for it.
at this point, I will just ask you, are we going to put the slides from this talk up on the Engage with DLD website after the talk, as well as the link to it, so that people don't need to feel that they have to take notes and stuff, they can access the slides?
Very good point. Thank you. Yes, we will. We'll put it on the website. I might ask Michelle if we're able to email it around, but probably just linking via the website will be the easiest way to do it.
So that people who just want to just sit back and have a cup of tea and watch you.
And enjoy some vocab research, yes. Thank you. So what we mean by word learning, it's really just that process of establishing vocabulary. So I suppose in another way, we talk about it as vocabulary development, but really this term word learning is the big term that we see all throughout the literature. But it really is just referring to that active sort of dynamic process of getting the words into memory. Really what we know about word learning is that there are multiple pieces of information that need to come together to be able to store that word effectively, to be able to use it across those different contexts, in a very functional way. And there's also a really key component related to our memory capacity, which, as I mentioned, is something that I was really, really interested in. Okay, so what does this process actually look like? What I'm going to do is just show you a brief overview of how the word learning process might work. And I'm going to particularly focus on the key pieces of information that we need sort of as a foundation for learning new words. I'm acknowledging that it is a very complex process and there are so many different components of word knowledge we ultimately need. We'll start with the basics. So here we have, I haven't actually named this child, let's call him John, because that's the only name I can think of. So little John is here on his, first birthday, and he's about to kind of encounter the new word for him, which is candle. And so he's about to experience this phenomenon that we tend to call fast mapping. So John is going to sort of see all of the grown-ups in the room and all of the friends, and they're directing their eye gaze, all of those social cues are directing him to have a look at that candle, and he might hear that word in a sentence context. So he might hear, blow out the candle. And so what happens in that moment, if word learning works as expected, is that they hear phonological form now, or the word form or the sounds in the word. That in itself can be quite complex and can be quite challenging because the child needs to actually be able to break down that sentence and identify the word and trigger that it's a new sort of lexical element for them, that it's new in the speech signal. So they have to hone in on that. And they also start to link all of those cues from the environment to create a sense of the referent or what it is that candle is referring to. So they start to just kind of map. I like to think of it as just these little keywords or these little components from that context. So little elements of meaning like hot, bright, fire, blow, all of those things from context. And they make a link between the two. And so since about the mid-1970s, there's this research that has started to talk about this phenomenon of fast mapping, which is that, if the process works well, even with just one or two little brief exposures, we're able to start to establish that word knowledge. So what we're doing there essentially is getting these brief little representations laid down between the word form or the phonological representation or the sounds in the word, and then linking that with semantic representation or kind of a bit of the meaning of the word. Now, obviously, in those initial little exposures, that fast mapped form is going to be quite brief. We're going to need to add to it if we want to be able to use that word really well and really functionally in the future.
And then you talked earlier about vocabulary breadth and vocabulary depth. And so I guess what you're saying here is that it's not very deep at this point. The knowledge in that way of this word at this point is still quite shallow, I suppose you could say.
Yeah, very surface level. And I like to think of it, I have lots of words I think that I've only heard once or twice, or I might have read them somewhere before. And so when you know that you hear that word and you go, I think I remember the meaning of that. I know that I've heard that before, but I can't really explain to you what it is, or I wouldn't be confident to use it in a sentence. So it's kind of that shallow word knowledge and the knowledge of the form. So those basics are the word form and the meaning. But over time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that over time process, but over time we also need to have other elements of that word knowledge to really be able to use it in the future in sentences, for example. So we also need to start to establish a sense of how its syntax works and how it would actually function within a sentence. So, for example, quite implicitly, but oftentimes we start to use clues like from the sentence context, looking at things like the fact that the word the comes before it, and it's indicating that it's a noun, it's a thing. So we start to establish that sense of how it would actually work grammatically or syntactically. More and more we encounter this word across different situations, we also get a bit of a sense of how we would use it socially. And, obviously when we're younger and little Johnny in that first context really only has a sense of how to use the word candle in a birthday setting, when he's looking at his birthday cake. But over time, through lots of exposure, he might get a sense of how to use it metaphorically, if we're talking about not being able to hold a candle against somebody else, if we're talking about how good someone is at something. This also links in with our morphology or the word parts. So we start to sort of learn how it links with other words and whether the word has different word parts that it can be broken into. And then also another way of representing the form is if we also then learn how to actually read it or use it in writing as well. So we might learn that orthographic representation. Sorry, it's the end of the day. My multisyllabic words are going to fall apart. So that's a bit of an attempt at sort of unpacking some of the different pieces of word knowledge that we need. And as I mentioned, it all kind of rests on the word form and the word meaning. But I also just want to highlight that that process doesn't just happen in one go, in a silo. It's also so important that we look at how that word knowledge evolves over time. And for me, it was really critical that we really pay attention to that, given that, quite a lot of people with DLD are shown to have challenges with things like their short-term memory and their working memory. And so it's, quite a lot of researchers now, especially us, we've really wanted to look at, how does the memory challenge potentially impact that word learning process? And so it's going to introduce another set of new terms, or for some of you, these might be familiar, but please do let me know if if you need me to clarify anything. So we're going to just focus now kind of on the chronological process of it, I suppose. So in that first instance of learning, the fast mapping process, when we really look at it through the lens of memory theory and the memory research, they tend to actually call that the encoding process. And I'm not going to say oversimplify it and say, oh, they're exactly the same thing, you know, because they come from two different sort of positions and theories. But really, encoding does capture the initial process of when our brain is exposed to a new stimulus, and it recognises that it's new, and it starts to lay down kind of some pieces of information from that environment. And Suze, I can see you're switched on.
So I guess I'm going to throw a question at you. So far, you've talked about this idea of fast mapping, which makes me think that slow mapping is coming up. And you've talked about encoding, and it makes me feel like there's something else going to come up. So are you going to talk to us a little bit? So I'm following along, obviously, that you're talking about those, you know, when you think about it, it's really complicated, all this stuff that's involved in learning vocabulary and learning words. No wonder some people have difficulties. So far, you've talked to us about those, the first few times you hear a word, the first bits you're starting to learn about it, and that will give us something shallow. I can think of many words I hear like that I haven't hung on to enough. But are you going to talk now about what happens next?
Yeah, absolutely. And then sort of try and move relatively quickly on what this actually means for the process for clinicians and families as well, because otherwise it's easy to get bogged down in the theory. So yes,
I know, but we love theory. That's the thing.
We love theory.
I know.
We love theory. And so those initial forms that we establish through just fast mapping, you know, a quick bit of encoding, what can then happen is that we go away from that environment, and hopefully those representations then become embedded and sort of become laid down in long-term memory, essentially. So it goes through this kind of consolidation process, and hopefully they get retained. And so there's some very interesting research, not done by us, but very interesting research that looks at the impact of things like sleep on consolidation. But really, sleep is a very important process for actually consolidating what we've learned throughout the day and establishing it, you know, without interference, and laying it down in long-term memory. So super, super interesting, you know, area there. I
agree.
Well.
And I think it would be, have we had a talk on sleep and learning yet?
We did, didn't we? Henderson. Yeah.
That's right. So that's up on our website if people are interested in understanding about the impact of sleep on learning. It's such an interesting area of research, and it has such impact.
Fascinating. And there's been some research with toddler groups that look at the impact of daytime naps on word learning, and things like the frequency of naps and the length of naps, and really the key message is go off and have a nap because it's great for your vocab development.
I always knew there was a reason why I liked a good old-fashioned siesta.
mean, I'm not sure if the research has involved adults, but let's extrapolate, you know, who cares? We all need naps. So hopefully, you know, again, I'm saying if all goes well, you know, I'm talking about these sort of typical processes when they happen. We establish in long-term memory just little snippets of the phonological representation and a little bit of the semantic representation, hopefully to the point where if we experience that word again, we can go, oh yes, I've heard that, and the representations kind of refresh in our brain, and then we can keep adding pieces of information. But what can happen, of course, is that if encoding is a challenge, and if we haven't been able to lay down enough of, say, the sounds in the word, we might hear it again the next day or the next week and not necessarily recognize that we've heard that before, and refresh the representation and keep adding to it. It's almost as if we're sort of starting from scratch again. Which can make things very challenging and obviously can really impact that word learning process for people that have challenges with encoding. So I'll get to some of our findings on that in just a moment. But essentially, to answer your question, Suze, I have this lovely little, that's the extent of my animation abilities where it sort of went up. So hopefully what happens is that the representations are refreshed and essentially held in working memory from what we understand. And we add more clues and more kind of pieces of the semantic details. We also have the opportunity to hear the word form again and to really clarify if we've laid down the sounds accurately. Maybe we need to revise slightly. So that's what happens throughout that slow mapping process. And it really is quite an extended process that can happen again and again and again, you know, sort of never ending until the point where we know the word so well and we can use it across different contexts. And I think really we're always slow mapping, you know, and every now and again I catch myself going, oh, I thought that word meant something, but I've just realized it actually means something else, or I realized that I've been saying it slightly incorrectly. And so it really is a process that continues, you know, all the way throughout our life, but obviously childhood is where most of it is going to be happening. So I've already kind of alluded to this. At fast mapping or encoding stage, there's been quite a lot of research in this space, and this is something that our team has had a look at. They've really linked those fast mapping encoding abilities to short-term memory and working memory, particularly short-term and working memory for verbal or spoken information. And so for the clinicians in the room, you might know of some measures that evaluate short-term memory and working memory, but they include things like our non-word repetition or repeating digits. Digits forward is considered to be a measure of short-term memory. So that's where I say a string of numbers and the person repeats them back exactly the same. Short-term memory, there's no sort of manipulation of the information at all. But then verbal working memory is where we actually have to process it in some way. So that would be if I say a string of numbers and you have to repeat them in backwards order. So it kind of has that higher level cognitive demand involved there. So they're really, really useful measures because they, you know, we see that they are really quite predictive of that fast mapping process. And of course, the retention skills are more linked with long-term memory, and there hasn't been as much work in that space. You know, if you're interested, you might go off and have a read of some of the literature around declarative memory. I've got some references at the end if you're keen for that. But really, as I mentioned, the research isn't quite so well established in those long-term memory processes. What I just want to do at this point as well, I'm just kind of prefacing that I'm about to go on and talk about some of our findings, but really DLD, what we know about it is that it's so varied, and all of the young people who have DLD just have so many different strengths as well as very individual areas of need, and a lot of young people with DLD can have very good vocabulary skills, so I don't want this to be sort of broad brush, but the research, you know, most of the research deals with group averages, so there might very well be, you know, a number of individuals within those groups that have done really quite well, and we certainly see that, but because of the nature of research, we have to kind of distill them down into a group level. So I just want to sort of put that out there. It's really important that we are assessing individuals. And so if you are interested, you might like to scan the QR code there, or you can go back to the slides afterwards and follow the link. So this is one of our papers that our research team has published, Word Learning and Verbal Working Memory in Children with DLD. It came out in 2021. And this paper is open access or free to download. So you might like to go off and have a read if you're interested. So coming back to those models that we had at the start, We certainly found some really interesting findings in this study in terms of some relative strengths and also some areas of challenge for the children with DLD. And so the children in this study were in year 1 and 2. And so that's here in the Western Australian context. So they're children between the ages of 5 and 8. So we are talking about sort of those early school years. What I do want to add to that, though, is that people like Carla McGregor and Catherine Gordon's teams have also looked at word learning, but more with adults, young adults and sort of college-aged students. And so I certainly don't want to kind of speak on their behalf, but we do see similar patterns across the research with children and also with those slightly older sort of adolescent and young adult ages. So just in case you're interested in what does this mean for adults with DLD. So if we come back to, building the knowledge and learning the different parts of sort of meaning and the different parts of the words, what we tend to see is that learning the link between the form and what it means or what it looks like, that link is a relative strength. So we certainly found that there was no significant difference in that skill for our children with DLD and our children without DLD. And the way that we evaluate that skill is an identification task. So that's where we show all the items and we go, point to the X, point to the blah. So they really just have to have enough information stored to kind of differentiate between the different items. So we saw that was a real strength for these children, which was fantastic. However, when it comes to actually laying down all of the sounds in the word, that was quite challenging for the group of children with DLD. And so we evaluated that by, teaching the names of the items, and we also taught them how to describe the items, all the semantic features. And then we asked them to name the items. So we showed them and said, what's this called? And they did have trouble actually sort of recalling or being able to recall all of the sounds in the right order without sort of swapping out sounds or changing syllables around. So that was certainly challenging for them.
So can I just clarify for me? So what you're basically saying is that in their fast mapping stage, the children with DLD had learnt enough about the word, the sounds associated with the word to enable them to recognise it, but not enough to always be as accurate in producing it themselves. Nothing to do with the clarity of their speech, but to do with the fact that when you say something, you need to know a bit more and be a bit more precise, where you can actually recognise something on a bit more partial knowledge.
Yes.
And so that's why there's that difference, yeah?
Yeah, so
it wasn't to do with their pronunciation skills.
No, it wasn't. We controlled for speech sound challenges. Yeah, thank you. We also saw that challenge with meanings, and so we evaluated that by asking them to, describe the items, tell us the semantic features, recall all of those features, and so that was a challenge for these students as well. And so, like with a lot of the word learning literature, we didn't go into a huge amount of depth in terms of being able to use it in a sentence and the morphemes and so on. That would be wonderful to be able to do that, but we didn't do that in this study. What we would
we need a nice big research grant so we can do that.
We need some money. Yes, please. But what we would assume is that because that foundation knowledge is challenging, it would perhaps have an impact on those other aspects of word knowledge as well. What about the actual process over time? So we taught these children new words over 4 days. They were very patient with me, which I really appreciated. So I saw them 4 days in a row at school just for some little short vocab sessions. And so on that first day, it was the fast mapping or kind of the encoding day. And then I also taught them those new words again on the second day, and then on the third day, and then on the fourth day, no teaching. I tested their knowledge. So I just administered those retesting tasks. And so what we can see in orange there, what I'm trying to represent in a relatively straightforward way, because there was a lot of data, the encoding stage was really challenging for these children at a group level. So we already saw these very significant differences emerge between the children with DLD and without DLD. However, what we saw when we unpacked the data is that actually the consolidation and the retention was a relative strength for these children. So we were able to make some links there. Again, you know, at a group level, these children had challenges with their verbal short-term memory and verbal working memory, and that was very, very predictive of those challenges with encoding or fast mapping.
So what you mean by that is that the children who had weaker short-term and working memory were generally the ones that had difficulty or more difficulty with that fast mapping phase. Oh, is that what you're about to say? Sorry.
No, I actually don't have that on a slide per se, because I wasn't sure how much data we should get into for the purpose of today.
But that's kind of what we're saying. That they're definitely, yeah. But we would also say is that doesn't mean that you can train short-term memory or working memory and that will improve fast mapping. What it actually has is implications for how we teach words in those early stages to support fast mapping, which I think is probably what you're going to start to talk about now.
Hit the nail on the head. No, that's exactly right. I also just wanted to highlight a bit of a pattern. You know, it's a little bit messy, but really what we can see here is the children with typical language skills in grey, and then the children with DLD in green. And this one is just showing that naming ability. So the ability to, you know, when they're shown the item, tell me what its name was. I won't go into all the depth of the other measures, but what we saw is this significant difference between the groups emerge at day one, so at that fast mapping stage. And what we saw is that the children with DLD did not fall further and further behind. And if they had, that would have perhaps indicated to us retention challenges as well, that they were going away and actually forgetting at a much faster rate than the children with typical language. But we actually saw that they sort of maintained almost that rate of learning across the days. And that pattern has certainly been echoed in other research as well. We did have this very interesting finding at day 4 when we just asked them to retrieve or to, you know, be tested on the items. We saw that all the groups dropped. And really that was just a bit of a limitation of our protocol. We realized that actually we had not trained the words with enough intensity. You know, we thought we had, but obviously, you know, hindsight is everything. We needed a higher level of intensity for them to really remember them.
And that's come through in lots of the research, that you actually need to expose children and teach children words a lot in those early stages. But it's pretty clear to me, looking at this, is that the kids with DLD sort of progressed, but they found it a lot harder than the kids with typical language. But they all found it hard with only 3 exposures to learn new words.
Well,
I can identify with that myself. 3 days
absolutely.
of exposure. I can identify that with myself. I need a few more exposures to learn a new word.
You need a lot more. What I should say, actually, it wasn't 3 exposures. It was 3 teaching sessions, but it was, if anyone's interested in the numbers, it was 24 exposures. Might be relevant because some other people like Holly Storkel have looked at 36 exposures for kindergarten age children as kind of optimal intensity. I don't want to put a number on it because that leads us down dangerous territory.
Had we known some of the other work when we started doing this, we might have done a few more exposures.
We would have done a bit more. Yeah.
Okay, I'll stop interrupting you.
I know, that is absolutely fine. I'm very mindful of the time, and I could talk for hours and hours. I definitely have a few more slides where we talk a bit more about implications, and I'm going to share some of my favourite strategies with some links to Word Aware, Stephen.
No, we call him Thinking Talking tonight.
But what I might do at this point is just sort of pause and stop talking for a moment, because I've presented lots of information and there's been lots of terminology in there So,
there are a couple of questions already in the chat function,
yes.
Em, so I might just pass them over to you. So
Perfect.
Someone has asked, even if speech was okay now, which it was there any link with earlier speech difficulties and so maybe more of a poorer motor memory of a word? I don't think we found that. It's a good question, but I don't think we found that. I think for us it was more an increased difficulty with laying down the knowledge of sounds.
Yeah, and so some of these children did have some phonological challenges or a bit of a kind of isolated articulation level challenge, and so certainly it would be great to explore a little bit more, but we really didn't have children that had significant sort of histories of speech, as in motoric
No. So
yeah,
this really is a language issue. A second, so we'll take maybe 3 or 4 questions and then we'll move into the next little bit of the talk. Someone's asking if all our participants were monolingual. My recall is they weren't necessarily monolingual, but English was their main language.
English was their primary language. Again, we would love to do this with even more sort of culturally and linguistically diverse children, but yeah, English was primary language, but some of them were certainly bilingual. We have. Yes, we have.
And then someone's asking if we would always advocate to do a digit span assessment. So I guess I might even broaden that and say, if we think that working memory and short-term memory play an important part in early stage encoding and fast mapping, should that be part of our assessment to help us think about the young people we're working with?
I mean, I think yes. I think yes.
We think yes.
Non-word repetition. Non-word repetition in itself is almost more powerful, and we certainly went down the track of trying to find out, is one of those measures more powerful than the other. From memory, non-word repetition, they were both significant predictors, but non-word repetition even more so. And just because
when you think about it, non-word repetition task is a little bit like a fast mapping task the sense of you're not maybe encoding meaning because there isn't anything, it's a nonsense word, but you're certainly encoding the initial sound structure of the word.
It is. And with it being a clinical marker as well of DLD, I think, I would always advocate for that one, but digit span could certainly be included as well.
Forwards and backwards if possible. So forwards in terms of short-term memory and backwards in terms of working memory. Yes. Got that right?
Yes, you did.
Any other questions? I think that's all of the questions so far. So just in the interest of time, we've only got about another 15 minutes or so, Em. I'm going to suggest that you carry on with your into the strategy section of the talk.
Sounds great. Thank you. But, please keep adding questions if they pop up for everybody. So what does this mean for home, classroom and clinic? Again, it's always tricky going into these because I don't quite know who's going to be in the audience and what people's prior knowledge is going to be coming from all over the world. So some of you might well know about, these frameworks. If not, though, here we go. Some of my favourite things. And what I should say as well is, that we've certainly considered our research in this, but I have also linked in some other resources and things as well that have come from the broader literature. So it's always tricky to kind of know which words we might need to work on, if we're thinking about, we're going to take some words and to really try and, see how a child goes with fast mapping and slow mapping, or try and do some really great instruction or intervention. What we tend to recommend is that these tier 2 words are really great ones to work on. So tier 1 words being sort of those basic, very common words that we tend to use every day. They're obviously great foundational words. And for some children, we certainly need to work on those. We also have, if we jump to the top, we have our tier 3 vocabulary, which is very topic specific words. So they are very useful if we're in a particular subject at school, for example, but we don't tend to use them very frequently, particularly across different contexts. So tier 2 words are words that are high frequency and they can be used across different contexts. And if we do use them, they have sort of this ability to convey more nuanced meaning and a higher level of understanding They're also words that a child tends to know concept of. So, for example, if we think about word walk as the tier 1 word, we might, they already know the concept of that, but we're just going to build a different representation and teach them meander or wander or whatever it might be. So we're building up on that conceptual knowledge that's already there. Here are some tools that I find helpful. Again, I won't sort of talk through them because, you haven't got the links right now, but when you come to see the slides, you might like to click on these because there are certainly some very useful places where you can go if you're trying to find different types of academic vocabulary and things, particularly setting, targets for intervention. You might like to think of Goldilocks words. I hope I'm going to get this right, Stephen. But words that are just the right level of complexity. I love that phrase, particularly, if I'm talking with families and we're trying to talk about the level of word that we're really working on. You also might like to think about, really trying to target those words that a child with DLD or an older student with DLD is not necessarily going to pick up very well if they're left to their own devices, to be able to just sort of learn incidentally, because there are certainly a lot of words that are going to be really, really challenging to learn incidentally if we don't have, explicit attention paid to them. So I'm thinking here particularly about our abstract words, so words that we can't kind of see, words that we can't perceive through the senses. It might be sort of, emotion words or cognitive words. There are lots of words that are really challenging for us to be able to see and pick up from context. So you might like to work on those sorts of words. So just as a little example there, we can see our very concrete words all the way through to our more abstract words. In terms of where are we teaching new words, there's certainly no one right place to do this. And I think there's so many opportunities in terms of just socially, if we have a sense of how to really explicitly teach a new word to somebody, we can do it absolutely anywhere. And that's actually so much more authentic because they're actually hearing it in context. And so they can use all those great social cues to start adding to their semantic representation. But also, of course, we know that book sharing is a great opportunity. As children start to move sort of from middle through to upper primary as well, reading generally becomes their primary source of vocabulary development. I do just want to sort of highlight there as well, though, that some of our students or a lot of our students with DLD might also have challenges with decoding. So we certainly need to be trying to balance them practicing their actual reading skills, but also still be listening to really high quality books if their decoding is a challenge for them. So having a bit of a combination of the two. Regardless of where we're teaching these new words, though, whether it's in the car or over the dinner table or, in the classroom, what we see from the literature is that most students with DLD will really benefit from a highly explicit vocabulary instructional approach. And so this is also not mine, but based on the work of Isabel Beck. So when you come to have a look at the slides, you might like to have a little read through this sequence. It's been tried and tested many, many times across the research. But I love this because we can see that it forms the foundation for teaching the phonological skills or the phonological representation, as well as that semantic representation. So we say the word, they repeat the word, we say the meaning, they have a go, coming up with the meaning, but we also interact with different examples. Suze.
Well, I look at this and how obsessed I am with psycholinguistic theory, good old Stackhouse and Wellesian type of stuff. I look at that and I see a really strong theoretical sense of building up the different kinds of representations of a word in here. So sounds, sound structure, semantics, etc., etc. So I even though this is 10 years old, it's got strong theory. That's all I wanted to say. You know how I love a good theory. Emily, you've just disappeared. Don't leave me. I can't give this talk without you.
So you can finish the presentation, right? No,
except I can't, because I can't flick the slides. You're in control.
Well, you'll have to wing it. No, I was just going to give an example, which I always like to give. One of my favorite books that I've worked on with children is The Water Tower, particularly with slightly older children. And there's this wonderful example in here about sort of the water and the moss that's all festering. And so I often found myself sort of stopping at that moment and going, tier 2 word, let's address the word festering in that context, say it, the syllables, the definition. But then the other part that I, you always just need to slightly think ahead about is kind of what are these other examples I'm going to give so that they broaden the context and they don't just think of the word festering, when we're reading The Water Tower.
You have to be a little bit careful with a word like festering as to where you might end up.
I mean, here's one I prepared earlier.
Ew.
Yeah, but it could have been so much worse, and then remember this.
Oh, God, that's a little bit big on my screen. Take it away.
Sorry.
Right now. It's festering.
Right? Okay, there we go.
I'm festered.
So having those other examples ready to go or, having your computer so you can sort of, extend and start to do that semantic networking.
I know, my goodness, I look at this sort of thing and I'm minded of the work of Pip St. John, aren't I, Stephen Parsons? I can see you there, this sort of stuff, Maggie Vance and Pip St. John. And we've got the Pip St. John stuff. Is that on the NAPLIC website now? It's hosted on the NAPLIC website. So she did a lot of this sort of work with Maggie Vance in classrooms in England.
Yeah, beautiful. So look, nothing hugely new, but just a nice reminder to bring that in, particularly at that stage where you're giving definition and you're really building that knowledge. We need to explore all those aspects of the word meaning.
And thinking constantly of that move from fast mapping and encoding through numerous repetitions and opportunities because you're slow mapping through to that consolidation phase, and that the young people we work with need more and explicit.
That's exactly right. And so that framework that Isabel Beck and colleagues gives us is fantastic. It forms that foundation for making sure that we're targeting phonology and the semantic aspects, but we also see that we just need to provide them with a huge amount of opportunity. We can't just say it once or twice. We need to be saying it lots of times within that initial session and also having the child say it back to us many, many times and in different sentences, explaining the meaning very clearly in multiple ways. Then we need that plan as well.
Okay.
Because,
so Emma, I've got some bad news, which is we've only got 5 more minutes.
We do.
So, and I don't know whether the link's going to stop. So how will we go? Because we've got a few more slides.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly whiz through the final bits.
I'll be quiet.
And then people can go off and read. No, all good. So we need that plan for our initial session, but also coming back to it lots and lots of times. Again, not our research, but people might be interested in some of the extra cues that we can be giving. So there's some really interesting research done about the presence of orthography or the written word while you are saying it, and introducing the word. And so this team, this sort of thing where it's obviously a nonsense word that they're teaching, but they had 2 different conditions, one where it was just the item and they heard this is a dwarf, and then in the other condition they had this is a dwarf, but they also had it written above it, or sorry, doaf it must be, sorry, it wasn't reading properly. And for the children that saw the written version, it actually was significantly helpful in terms of them establishing the phonological form. And so these were children that had at least basic reading skills, not necessarily super strong reading skills, but it was really, really helpful. So just thinking about those multisensory
I know that works for
modalities.
me. Yeah. If I see a word written down or I've written it down myself, I'm much more likely to remember it.
Yeah. A couple of other things people can have a look back if they find them helpful for that slow mapping phase, coming back and exploring the word. I love things like a Frayer model where they sort of have to go off and form their own definition and explore the meanings in different ways. So again, I'll put all of these up. And also make sure that we're not just teaching it, but we're also getting the student to actually retrieve it actively, because the passive learning can be fine, but particularly to support that retention of word knowledge, we have to actually test them on it. So we have to sort of stop teaching, stop giving input at a certain point and actually ask them, remember that word, can you name it? Can you tell me what it meant? Because even if they get it wrong, that active retrieval process is really, really helpful in terms of consolidating and laying down the correct forms.
So if we've got people, in the audience who work in classrooms, that could involve maybe like one child teaching another child a word. I mean, obviously we'd have to be monitoring to make sure they're teaching them everything. Right. But, the act of teaching it to someone else might be a natural, more functional way of practicing.
Absolutely. And also, the good news is, the spaced practice and the short bursts of practice is the most helpful thing, rather than trying to squeeze a big 60-minute session in just lots of little snippets of practice. So a lot like our other areas of SLT practice, short bursts is more helpful than big sections of massed practice when it comes to this area.
Yeah, that work by Katie Gordon's been really good.
Fantastic. And I also finish off on the slides by talking about how do we actually check in and evaluate whether, they've learned it, whether we're doing a good job with our teaching and whether the student is learning it. So I'll include that there in the slides for you to have a look at.
Just go back one slide. I don't think we're going to get cut off. To me, this is lovely because what this gives us is a scoring system for depth. And so I think a lot of SLT practice, we're not too bad at breadth, as in how many. But as we've been talking a lot today, it's not just how many words you know, it's how deep you know the words you do know, because that's about how you can use them. And so we do lack ways of assessing depth. And so something like this lovely scoring system out of this latest paper, this 2023 paper, is a really useful resource, I think, for speech language therapists and teachers.
Yes, it is. And, even just us knowing about assessing the comprehension of a word as well as the expression. I think we get quite caught up in kind of, can you put it in a sentence for me? So they're able to sort of throw it in a sentence, but we're not necessarily exploring all the different ways of knowing it and exploring that depth of different methods for comprehending and different methods for expressing it. So I've tried to kind of summarize that there. And that was certainly something that we looked at in our research. We had, a huge amount of data because we had so many different outcome measures about can they hear it.
Katrina Kelso's done some work on that in her reading comprehension work, based around the work of, I think it's Sarah Spencer at Sheffield Uni in the UK. She's got some lovely measures with adolescents about this kind of thing. Word knowledge tasks.
So look, we won't spend too much time discussing, just because I'm mindful of the time, and as always I've talked for too long, but I'm certainly happy to hang around if people have some questions. I'd love to answer some questions if you do have them, but before I sort of we wrap up and things, Suze, I do just want to mention our language and literacy in young people website. So all of our research, all of our papers and everything, we have accessible downloadable versions of those on our website, and also Katrina Kelso's work, who you've just mentioned, all of the different people in our research lab.
And any papers that we've got that are behind a paywall on this website, we put up the free shareable version. So for the clinicians out there who are maybe struggling sometimes to get papers through a paywall, anything we do, you can get for free off of our research links there. Thank you, Em.
Thank you. And so just before I come to the chat box and things like that, I might just do a short little plug for some work that we've got going on at the moment. So this is not on word learning, but if anybody's particularly interested kind of the adolescent space or the young adult space, or any age of adults, actually we're really wanting to hear from people who have DLD or other ways of being neurodivergent, and we'd love them to be involved in a short interview where they we explore kind of what it's like to be on social media, you know, whether they've observed anything, any challenges, what they've learned about how to tackle social media.
They don't themselves have to have been cyberbullied. It's more their opinions about cyberbullying and social media. So we'd be really grateful if anyone would be interested. And I think we've been advertising this through E-DLD as well.
We have.
Cool.
We have.